Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie, and today I'm joined by Wayne Armstrong, who's one of our senior consultants at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider. So today, Wayne and I are going to be sort of going back to fundamentals of information security, risk assessment and risk treatment, sort of to understand which risks are relevant, just looking at the very basics of risk assessment. So my first question for you, Wayne, is what is risk?
I guess there's a kind of a simple answer to that actually on the face of it doesn't seem that simple when you read it, but it's often described as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. You kind of need to break that down a little bit to understand what that means, but all organizations have objectives that they need to achieve, whether that's expansion into a different market or protecting information or whatever it might be. But there are things out there that could cause issues that would mean that those objectives might not be met. And so therefore, unless we put some kind of process in place to understand what those things could be, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty around the business in whether or not those objectives can be achieved. And so it's the process of information risk management is all about identifying what those risks would be and eliminating that uncertainty so that we know what the risks are, we know where they are, we know why they're risks, and we know what we want to do with them. Risks can be positive and negative, so they can be they could represent an opportunity to be chased for an organization, but they could also be on the negative side, i.e. they are the things that cause those issues that prevent objectives being met. And it's mainly that side of things that we tend to find organizations concentrate on when they're looking at their information security risks.
Amazing. Thank you, Wayne. So how do you sort of define a risk?
Well, for me, there's we would consider risk to consist of three component parts. And whenever I'm teaching this in training courses, it's where I stand up in front of the class with a flip chart and I draw a triangle and I say that there are three component parts and each point of the triangle represents a different component. So the first thing you need is something that you care about. Generally, we refer to that as an asset. In our case, it's going to be an information asset. Yeah. So important information or information that's important to the business. And the way that we determine that importance is by putting some kind of value on it. And the value essentially comes from what the impact would be on the organization should that asset be compromised. And we talk about, as far as information security is concerned, we talk about the compromising the asset in terms of confidentiality or integrity and availability breaches. So we have some way of valuing the asset based on impact on the organization. So that would be one point of the triangle or one of the three component parts. The second component part or the second point of the triangle is about the threat that could cause the issue in the first place. So there are going to be, hundreds, thousands of threats out there that could cause all sorts of different issues for different organizations. And it's about identifying what those threats are and understanding things around the nature of the threat, how likely the threat is to be targeted at you, depending upon how your organization works, etc. Whether that threat has occurred in the past, whether it's an easy kind of attack that could be launched in order to cause damage, etc. So all of that kind of information needs to be understood about the nature of the threat, but in essence, it's the thing that could cause the damage to the asset. And then the third component or the third point of the triangle is known as a vulnerability or a weakness. So this is something within the system or within the asset itself that allows the threat to materialize and thus cause damage. So you have to have all three component parts for risk to be apparent. So we evaluate them all separately to determine essentially an understanding of what the likelihood is of a certain event occurring, and also if that event occurred, what the impact on the organization would be.
So once you've sort of defined a risk or identified your risks, how do you then assign value to a risk?
So we can use the information that we know about the three component parts to start putting some values in place. So we tend to advocate the use of simple scales to do this. And in terms of coming up with a value for risk, it's a simple calculation. It's about the level of impact that would be felt by the organisation if something went wrong, multiplied by the chances of that thing going wrong, or the likelihood of that thing going wrong. And so we end up with two scales. One for impact, one for likelihood. We tend to use a 1 to 5 scale, but that's not set in stone. You could use whatever scale you wanted to. But when we multiply the two values together, impact times likelihood, we get an overall value for risk. One thing worth pointing out is I mentioned we've got three component parts for risk, but we've only got two things that we multiply together in order to come up with a risk value, impact and likelihood. So we've got impact. We already know that from valuing the asset in terms of impact on the organization if something should go wrong. So that's one point of the triangle. And then what we use is the other 2 points of the triangle. So information about the threat itself, and also information about the level of vulnerability that we have that would allow the threat to get to the asset. We use those two pieces of information together in order to give us an understanding of likelihood. And so we multiply the two values together, and that gives us an overall value for risk.
Do different organisations have different priorities, and are there certain risks that organisations can set aside?
Yeah, so obviously we've got lots of different types of organisations whose business objectives are going to be different. And some types of risk are more important to some organisations than others. So, for example, some organisations would be very tolerant of financial risk, for example, because maybe they're cash risk rich. They've got lots of money in the bank, so they're not too worried about taking financial risk. But on the other hand, they might be very averse to health and safety risk or legal and regulatory risk, etc. And so one of the things that needs to be understood by organizations probably before they even start thinking about valuing risk is, well, what is my risk appetite going to be? How much risk of different types am I willing to tolerate before I need to start taking action? So this is generally known as your risk appetite. And it can be expressed numerically. So if you think about those impact and likelihood scales, if you plotted those onto a matrix, a 5x5 matrix, you could probably draw a line through that matrix that says below certain numbers within the matrix, below certain risk values, we're willing to accept that risk or tolerate that risk without taking further action. So that's one way of prioritizing risks in the first instance, and it removes a lot of the noise in terms of the fact that we might identify lots of different risks, but we can park a number of those or put a number of those to one side by saying, well, they're below my appetite, so therefore I'm just going to accept those. And then for the rest of the risks that are above appetite, we can set different strategies depending upon what they are. So if they're legal risk or financial risk, etc., we can prioritize one above the other, and obviously use the values that we've determined using impact times likelihood to identify the risks that are more important than others. And the idea would be that you generally tackle the higher value ones first, drive them down into lower values, and then keep doing that over a period of time until eventually you may end up in a position where you've reduced risk to such a degree that everything looks like it's acceptable and it's below your risk appetite.
Once we've identified, valued and prioritised risks, what do we actually do with them?
This is where we start talking about risk treatment and risk treatment decisions. So one of those treatment decisions I've mentioned, which is about risk appetite and accepting risk or tolerating risk that's below appetite. By the way, it doesn't have to be below appetite in order for you to be able to accept risk, but there tends to be a lot of rules around accepting risk that's higher than the risk appetite. There has to be a valid reason why you would accept that risk. So, for example, I don't have the budget to put the actions in place that would address that risk. So therefore, I'm forced into a position of accepting the risk, and that would be signed off by a senior manager for a period of time, etc. But that's just one treatment option, the acceptance of risk. We could also do other things, so we can share risk or transfer risk. The idea of this is that for certain risk types, we can transfer some of the risk to a third party. So an example of this would be with regard to financial risk. We could offset the financial impact on the organization by taking out an insurance policy. So if the event occurs that causes the financial impact, the idea is that the policy pays out and offsets the impact on the organization from a financial point of view. You can also outsource the implementation of and management of technical controls, for example, to managed service providers that are in a better position to be able to manage those controls for you, therefore potentially reducing the likelihood that something would go wrong. So that's transfer or share. We can avoid the risk altogether. There's a very limited scope for that in terms of how you can do it. So if you think back to the 3 points of the triangle, the only reliable way of actually eliminating risk altogether is by getting rid of the asset. So if we've got no asset to protect, we don't really care if there's any threats or vulnerabilities out there, because there's not going to be any impact because the asset's no longer with us. You can't really do it by removing either of the other 2 points of the triangle, because we can never really guarantee that we've identified all the threats. And similarly, we can never really guarantee that we'll identify and eradicate all the vulnerabilities. So therefore, the only reliable way is getting rid of the asset. And then the other option, other treatment option, is to modify the risk value somehow. So this is usually by implementing different controls, most of which will address likelihood. And they could be technical controls or people process controls or physical controls, all sorts of different things that we can do to try and mitigate the risk and therefore reduce the risk over time to a more tolerable level.
So you mentioned earlier about some risks being set aside. Once you do that, are they always ignored, or do you need to sort of go back and revisit them?
No, you would tend to have an iterative process for risk assessment, review of risk, whatever you want to call it. So probably something like on an annual basis, you will go back to your risk treatment plan, for example, or your risk register, where you've recorded all of the information about your different risks, and you'll review all of the risks that were identified previously to determine if anything has changed. And that will include all of the risks that you previously accepted, because obviously things can change, and that could be outside our control. It could be changes to legislation, for example, or changes to the way the business works, mergers and acquisitions, or changes in technology, etc. So therefore, that might mean that some of your risks that were previously accepted may no longer be tolerable. They may have increased in value. And so, yeah, you would put some kind of timescale on that, probably annual. And then with the other risks, depending upon how important they are, if you've got sort of a low, medium, and high sort of separation between your different risks that you've identified, the low ones are the ones that you've previously accepted. Medium ones would probably be reviewed every 6 months or something like that by an appropriate authority, probably a head of department or an asset owner or something. And then your red risks, the really serious ones, are probably going to be reviewed much more frequently, probably monthly, and probably by senior management, the CEO or the board or etc., because it would be those that have the authority to accept risks at that level, and therefore they need to review them.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time today, Wayne. If any of our readers want to read up on this subject, Wayne has written a fantastic blog which is on our website, urmconsulting.com, and it is called Information Security Risk Assessment and Treatment, Understanding Relevant Risks. So do go and check that out. And thank you very much for listening today. We will see you next time. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.